Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Destiny 2 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Destiny. It was developed by Bungie and published by Activision in September of this year for PS4 and Xbox One, and the PC version was released later on in October. The game was pretty well received on its launch, although since that launch it's actually gotten a lot of criticism, especially with regards to the endgame experience system where Bungie had messed with it and made it much more of a grind than it actually should have been. And at this point, if you ask someone in the Destiny community what they think about it, you're just as likely to find someone who thinks it's an atrocity as someone who thinks it's the best thing ever. So what is the reality of Destiny 2? Does it learn from the original Destiny's mistakes and improve upon things, or does it do something else entirely? Well, let's go ahead and start delving in this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's definitely a step up over the original Destiny, although it's not a very large step. There is quite a lot of asset reuse, which really isn't that surprising given that this takes place not very long after the events of the original Destiny, and you're actually dealing with a lot of the same equipment, a lot of the same enemies, that sort of thing. So in that instance, it's kind of a why fix what isn't broken, but they do touch up a few of the models here and there. They definitely touch up the textures quite a bit, and the particle effects look excellent, although that could just be because I'm playing this on PC and I maxed out all the graphics settings. And as far as the PC version is concerned, not only does it look great, but it has pretty much all the features you could really want out of a PC version except for one, which I'll get to when I get to the gameplay section. So if you're looking for a pretty extensive graphics option menu, then it's definitely got that. It's got an adjustable field of view, which is greatly appreciated considering how terrible the FOV was in the previous game. If you're running a 4K monitor or an ultra-wide monitor, then it's got native support for those, and best of all, it has an uncapped frame rate, which if you run a monitor with a high refresh rate like I do is definitely well appreciated. And on top of all of that, it runs butter smooth. Now admittedly, I am running a rather powerful rig. I'm running a GTX 1080, 16 gigs of RAM, and an i7-4790K. Your mileage of course may vary a bit depending on what your specific hardware is, but I never saw a drop below 60 frames per second at all. And most of the time it was well above 60 frames per second even during intense firefights, so they've definitely done a very good job at optimizing the game. As long as your PC is decent, then you should have performance much better than that of the consoles, because consoles are locked at 30 frames per second. And once you get past the visual quality upgrade over the previous Destiny, and of course over the console version if you're talking about the PC release, then you find that it basically takes the original Destiny's sci-fi aesthetic and just kind of runs with it. The end result is a game that, while certainly not in the upper echelons of PC game graphics, definitely looks very good for what it is. Then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit iffier, because you have a rather strong soundtrack that is a good mix of electronic with orchestral, with a bit of rock mixed in here and there for added effect. Despite the soundtrack being good, however, there are a couple of issues with it. First off, it often does not match the action that's going on screen. You might have music that's sounding like it's trying to be super epic, and the firefight that you're in is with maybe a handful of the weakest enemies in the game. Whereas in another instance, you might be fighting a large horde of enemies and you might be barely clinging on to life, but the music is just not really all that high intensity. That's more of a missed opportunity than anything else, but the one really nasty problem with the music is that it's way too friggin' loud. For some utterly baffling reason, Bungie decided not to put a music volume slider in the game, and they didn't do that on the console version either, so you just kinda have to live with either music or no music, and if you do decide to go with the music, then be prepared to turn down your volume because it's gonna be very loud. You would think by this point that putting in a music volume slider would not be that big of a deal and that it should be a standard feature, but apparently not, because some of the most modern releases only have a music on or off button. Apparently it requires way too much effort to put in a feature that was pretty much standard issue back in the 90s. But oh well, what about the rest of the sound design? Well, the sound effects are generally pretty decent, although a lot of them are almost too futuristic. By that I mean a lot of the energy weapons don't really have a lot of oomph to them, they just sound like pew-pew lasers, and while that's pretty much what you would expect, in a lot of cases they sound like really wimpy pew-pew lasers. Meanwhile, hand cannons sound like, well, hand cannons. Yeah, they still sound fairly powerful, so do shotguns and sniper rifles, and really anything that's actually supposed to sound powerful. They're not as beefy as I'd really like, but they're still beefy compared to most other video games out there right now, so that's definitely something worth noting. Then of course there's the voice acting, which is generally pretty solid across the board, although some of the voices are a bit stiff here and there, and Cade 6 really just steals the show because it's Nathan Fillion, and Nathan Fillion's a goofball. But generally speaking, when you bring everything together, you have rather solid presentation across the board with a few slip-ups here and there. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place sometime after the events of the original Destiny, and you play presumably as the same Guardian that you played as in the original game, although that does come into question a few times when the character doesn't seem to know anything, or the ghost doesn't seem to know anything about things they should know about. I have a feeling that that was done to kind of ease new players into the game because they anticipated there'd be an influx of new players from the PC version compared to the console version, but at the same time, it does end up causing a few noticeable plot holes here and there. Not to mention that from what I've seen in the game, it seems like they've completely disregarded the entirety of the Rise of Iron expansion, so that's kind of annoying, but other than that, it does take place after the events of the original Destiny, it's seemingly after the Taken King, and the salient point with your character is that you are a Guardian, someone chosen by the Traveler, this massive orb in the sky that gives you magic powers, basically, and your entire purpose is basically to safeguard humanity and fight off the darkness. The darkness, of course, being this nebulous evil that's off somewhere in space and has never been explained at all. Now here's the thing, unlike the original Destiny, which had a few vignettes here and there and didn't really have that much of an overarching plot, this game actually does have a beginning, middle, and end. The game opens with an alien race called the Cabal, specifically the Red Legion faction within them, attacking the last city and capturing the Traveler. This actually cuts off the light from all of the Guardians, and basically renders them completely powerless and helpless. It's at this point that you're introduced to the main antagonist of the game, the leader of the Red Legion, Dominus Gall, who is, of course, as generic as he could possibly get. His entire motivation is that he wants the Traveler's light for himself. He wants it to choose him because he thinks that he deserves it, and that everybody else doesn't deserve it because they are weak and he is clearly superior to all of them. In other words, we have yet another villain where his entire motivation is that he just views everyone else as vermin to be exterminated, and you basically have to prove him wrong. It's a pretty lazy setup, and the actual storytelling ends up being extremely lazy as well. It's much in the same vein as the original Destiny, where you go from planet to planet, you go on your various story missions, and eventually you have a showdown with the final boss. But unlike with the original Destiny, where the entire plot was nebulous and didn't really make a whole lot of sense, this one actually does have a plot that you can follow, and it is not remotely difficult to understand. Unfortunately, though, it's just not all that interesting. I mean, you start off the game and you're just your normal Guardian, and then you lose your powers. And then you have to go through a segment where you don't have your powers, and they're all like, oh no, the light is gone. How can we possibly fight against this? Oh, by the way, you're going to get your light back in like 5 minutes. It pretty much completely trivializes the idea of losing your light, and it also introduces a pretty gaping plot hole, which is that, as far as you can tell, there was only one way to get your light back, and you were the one who used it all up. So at the very least, until you've actually finished the game, how the hell did all these other Guardians get their powers back? Well, there's just an infinite supply of shards of the Traveler? I mean, they make it pretty abundantly clear in the actual storyline that you are the only one with your light back. Literally none of the other Guardians have it. It's never even mentioned in the game at all. They don't explain why that is, and you end up with one of those situations where you just have to suspend your disbelief, which is actually fairly difficult to do when the entire plot revolves around you being the Chosen One. Here's the main problem with trying to do a Chosen One storyline in a game like Destiny 2. It's a multiplayer game. You can't do a Chosen One story and have it make any sense at all. And even as far as Chosen One plots go, it's really just not a very good one, so it really doesn't help matters when your suspension of disbelief is constantly being shattered by the fact that you are one of many Guardians, except that you're the really special one. Because remember, as far as the storyline is concerned, it's all on you to not only get your light back at the very beginning of the game, but to rally the Vanguard, so you gotta get Cade, Ikora, and Zavala back together, and you have to organize an attack on the Red Legion's super weapon called the Almighty, and of course free the Traveler and take your city back. It's all very predictable, and it all leads to a showdown with Dominus Gall himself, and the final boss fight is extremely underwhelming. And I won't really spoil the ending of the plot here for you, but suffice to say, it's also fairly underwhelming, and it's painfully obvious that they're using it just as a setup for eventual DLC. Which they've already confirmed is definitely a thing, and they already have 2 expansions planned for it, the first of which is called Curse of Osiris, and is supposed to come out fairly soon. Honestly though, given how bad of a value the expansions for the original Destiny are, I'm certainly not going to be picking up Curse of Osiris or any of the other expansions at full price. I'm going to wait for a price drop if that ever actually happens. Now, it is worth noting that the original Destiny had a very similar problem, where it was obviously set up for eventual DLC, but the DLCs never really explained anything. You got almost nothing from them as far as storylines and as far as actual lore for Destiny goes. Time will tell if the same thing happens with Destiny 2's DLCs, but as for the actual game, you do get more lore and backstory and everything in this game than you do in the original, but that's not really saying much. So while it's certainly better to have some lore rather than basically none at all, it still needs quite a lot more lore and quite a lot more explanation of what's going on, who the various factions are, how they operate, that sort of thing. Because as it stands, there's really not a whole lot of stakes in this. You don't really have time to get attached to the city or its inhabitants, and even the various characters that you encounter you really don't have time to get attached to either. The only one with any real degree of personality is Cayde 6, and like I said before, he's voiced by Nathan Fillion, who's a complete goofball, and he basically plays Cayde 6 off as a complete goofball. That means that Cayde 6 is amusing, but the other 2 vanguards are fairly bland and uninteresting. And of course that's a problem that plagued the original Destiny as well, but here it's amplified by the fact that they have a greater emphasis on story and storytelling. Thus, when you bring all of the writing together, you find that while it is certainly an improvement over the original Destiny, that's really not saying much, and the whole writing aspect is actually rather weak. Thus, it really falls to the gameplay to bring things up, and that's where things get a bit messy. You see, the game is split into player versus environment, PvE, and player versus player, PvP modes, and the vast majority of the content is PvE. As a result, let me actually go ahead and get the PvP stuff out of the way, because honestly, there's not a whole lot to talk about here. It's split between the Crucible and the Iron Banner, and Crucible takes place between 2 different playlists. There's the casual and the competitive, and then there's the Iron Banner, which honestly I didn't mess with because it wasn't available at the time I was actually putting together the review. Unlike the previous Destiny, which was split between 3v3 and 6v6 modes, this one is exclusively 4v4 across all of the modes. This is whether you're playing the casual or competitive Crucible or even the Iron Banner. Iron Banner is exclusively set to one mode, and you basically just continue to play it over and over again for chances at particularly high level gear. But other than that, there's really not much of a difference between it and the regular Crucible gameplay, so it ultimately ends up becoming a very basic 4v4, either team deathmatch or an objective-based mode, and it's really nothing special at all. They completely disable the power level mechanic once you go into Iron Banner and Crucible, so you don't need to worry about people who are very high level with better gear than you just completely dominating you. But being higher level is certainly going to improve things for you because you'll have access to more abilities and you'll probably have some really good gear to go along with it. That even though the power level is not a problem in the Iron Banner or Crucible, the raw stats of the weapon, like the ammo capacity or the level of damage it inflicts just on a general sense or something like that, will definitely be a great help to you. As a result, even though they do disable the power advantages, you still are at a disadvantage if you're low level, just because you haven't upgraded your character enough and you probably don't have access to particularly great gear. It's certainly not impossible to succeed at low levels, but you're definitely going to have a harder time of it. But here's the thing, very few people play Destiny 2 or Destiny in general for the PvP, because frankly it's just not very good. It's rather bog standard, and on top of that it runs on peer-to-peer and matchmaking, resulting in inherent latency problems as well as just issues with matching you with players that are just straight up better than you. Or my personal favorite, opening up the possibility for people to use lag switches incredibly easily. Or in some cases, even worse things than that. Bungie, look. You need to use dedicated servers. It's more stable, it provides a much better gameplay experience, and it's more secure in the long run. And for all you Bungie apologists out there, do not try to say that it would cost so much for them to do that. This is Bungie and Activision we're talking about here. They could pull together an absolutely absurd amount of resources for this if they wanted to. They just chose not to, because that would require them to actually modify the netcode, and they apparently don't want to do that. So what we're left with in the long run is a game that's not just peer-to-peer in the PvP section, but it's actually peer-to-peer in the PvE section as well. There are numerous problems with latency and packet loss both in the PvP and in the PvE, but it is considerably more irritating in the PvP. And since the PvP is pretty much an afterthought and really has almost no value to it whatsoever, I pretty much ignored it for the most part. I certainly played enough for the purposes of this review, but I'm definitely not going to put any more time into the PvP after this. And that's because the real meat of the game is the PvE, going in there and playing co-op with your buddies or even just random people that you run across while you're running around and doing the various adventures or whatever it may well be. Or even just doing a lot of solo content, because pretty much everything you can do in the game except for the strikes and the raids is entirely doable in single player. So that of course brings up the question of what there is as far as the single player and co-op content. Well, usually you go from point A to point B, you wipe out every enemy in your path, and you may need to interact with something along the way. In this vein, it's pretty similar to playing the original Destiny, although there are a fair few changes in the actual mechanics that make it feel a bit different. Now, some of these changes are more significant than others. The one that changes the light level into a power level really doesn't do anything at all. It's just a name change more than anything else. But they made noticeable changes to the loot drops as well as the way your subclasses work. Now, when you start the game, you select your class and you are given a subclass to go through the intro bit with. And then once you get your light back, you are given a different subclass to start with. After a while, you'll see an item pop up in your inventory that says you need to complete public events or just kill enemies in order to eventually unlock it, and what you find out there is that that's one of your subclasses. Eventually you'll fill up that meter and it will unlock the ability to go on a quest in order to actually earn your new subclass. And this will happen twice throughout the course of the game, at least as far as the base game is concerned, because you'll have your starting class, and then you'll have 2 additional subclasses. So, for example, if you play a Warlock, which is my primary character, then you start with the Dawnblade class, and then the next one you unlock is the Voidwalker, which is what you actually started with in the beginning intro of the game, which is how they do that for all of the classes, by the way. And then eventually you unlock the 3rd subclass, which is the Stormcaller. The same sort of thing happens with all of the classes, it's just different subclasses that you unlock in different orders. That's one of the first very noticeable changes over the original Destiny, because the original Destiny just basically gave you your first subclass and then you had to earn the 3rd subclass after one of the expansions came out. They also changed the way that the subclasses are configured, because in the original Destiny you were able to set up your subclass and then you could swap out different abilities depending on how you wanted to tailor your playstyle. The same basic idea is present in Destiny 2, but they've simplified it. Instead of having a large selection of things to choose from there, they have condensed that into having 3 different grenade abilities, 3 different movement abilities, which you can select whatever you want at any time, and then you have 2 attunements per subclass. These are sets of 4 bonuses that you can get, and you can actually swap your attunement at whatever time you want as well. And despite it having the appearance of being less nuanced than the original Destiny's leveling system, frankly it works quite a bit better because the bonuses are a lot more tangible and they actually do affect the way you play a lot more. That's frankly a lot better than just giving you a bunch of passive bonuses that you don't even really notice. Once you get beyond the changes to the character development, they've also made quite a few changes to the loot, namely they have increased the drop rate and they have also increased the drop rate of legendaries by a considerable margin. After a certain point in the leveling, you'll actually never find a common item again, and once you hit max level, you no longer find any uncommon items, you only find rares, legendaries, and exotics. This means that not only are you a lot more likely to find items that you'll find actually useful by that point, but you'll actually be able to break them down into things that will allow you to actually upgrade the ones that you already have and really like by infusing the stronger items that you find along the way. It's pretty normal to find duplicates of the various legendaries that you're finding, so you can break those down and get legendary shards, which you can then use to infuse the legendaries and exotics that you have. What that basically requires is for you to find an item that has better stats than the one that you currently have. It has to be the same type of item, so for example, if you're trying to infuse a hand cannon, then you need to infuse it with another hand cannon. This costs an amount of glimmer, which is just the basic currency, and then you also require a few legendary shards in order to be able to do it. If it's converting from a rare up to a legendary or an exotic, it takes more of the legendary shards, whereas if it's a legendary that you're trying to infuse into another legendary or an exotic, then it only takes one. This means that if there's a particular item that you really like using, you really just like the way it looks or you like its certain effects, then you don't have to simply discard it once you find something that's more powerful. If it's of the same type, you can infuse it with that, and now it is at the same power level as whatever you infused it with. This ensures that once you hit max level, the gear that you're finding is never really useless. Either you can break it down into crafting parts in order to actually improve your various legendaries and exotics, or you can break it down into gunsmithing materials, which you can then turn into the gunsmith in order to get a new legendary engram. You see, there are various vendors set up all over the game, and they will actually take different forms of quote-unquote currency. These are just things that you find as you're running around doing your normal gameplay session. So, for example, if you're just wandering around the EDZ and you find some Dusklight, then you can take that back to Devrim and you can turn it in to increase the meter that he has in order to get a new legendary engram. With several of the vendors, there's actually different grades of the material that they'll accept as well. So, for example, with, let's just say, Devrim, then he'll accept Dusklight shards, which are the extremely basic form, and then he'll also accept a much more rare variant of Dusklight that you sometimes get instead of the Dusklight shards, and that gives you a bit more meter than what you would normally get from just the basic shards. And then for the most increase of the meter, you can give him EDZ tokens, which you get by doing the public events, by looting chests that are scattered around the EDZ, by taking out high-value targets and looting their loot chests that drop immediately after their death, and it actually ends up working out pretty well in the long run, because you'll just be earning this stuff as you're playing the game normally anyway. When you're going on the adventures, if you're exploring and finding all sorts of different things scattered around the levels, you'll be collecting these items anyway, and they seemingly have no use to you until you go back to these vendors, and you can put them towards earning a new legendary engram, which is guaranteed to contain a legendary item of some sort, as well as shaders and a few other things. This brings up something that's rather important to mention. There are engrams that you'll find as you're playing the game. You can kind of think of these as loot boxes, but they're just earned through normally playing the game anyway, except in the case of bright engrams, which you either earn normally by simply playing the game and leveling up past level 20, which is the maximum level at this point, and they'll just give you a bright engram every time you gain enough experience to level up again. Or you can spend real money on the premium currency of silver and use that to buy bright engrams. At this point, you're probably going, oh no, DW, they're doing the Battlefront 2 thing of making you have these tangible advantages from the bright engrams. Actually, they don't. The gear that you find in the bright engrams is actually very, very low powered, and you have to actually infuse it with the gear that you find normally in order to make it actually usable. Honestly, it's actually a really intelligent way of handling the gear if you're going to have microtransactions in the game to begin with. Because you're still going to have to earn the more powerful gear just by playing the game normally anyway, and if you get something cosmetic in your bright engram that you really like, then you can actually just bump it up to the power of the item that you found by simply playing the game normally. That way you're not giving a player an unfair advantage simply by them paying more money into the system. Now that said, there are still a few things that are a bit shady with regards to the bright engrams, namely things like the shaders, which is just across the entire game annoying because they are actually consumables now, instead of permanent things that you could get and just use whenever you wanted in the original Destiny. This means that you're most likely going to hang on to those shaders until you find something that you really, really like and you want to customize it. Luckily, the game does facilitate that for you, but it is pretty annoying that the shaders are consumable to begin with. It's pretty obvious that they're trying to push you a bit more towards paying into getting more bright engrams so you can get more shaders that are really cool. Honestly though, the shaders that I was getting from bright engrams really weren't doing all that much for me. They pretty much looked hideous, in fact. So of course your mileage may vary on whether or not the bright engram shaders are something that you really absolutely must have, but even then, you can earn bright engrams just by playing the game normally anyway, so you don't actually have to spend a dime. And since everything in the bright engrams is more cosmetic than anything else, honestly, it's not that bad. Now, there is the annoying factor of them messing around with the experience system in order to make it an absolute grind to keep leveling up past level 20, but honestly, getting up to level 20 was pretty much a breeze. I actually completed the story mode with 2 different characters, and both of those characters were maxed out on their levels by the time I finished the campaign. Now, of course, I did go off and do a few side quests as well as the various public events that I was running into, but I didn't go out of my way to do any of that. It was extremely easy to get up to level 20. And even after you hit level 20 and you start getting the bright engrams, it doesn't feel as much like a grind as Destiny 1 did. And a big reason for that is that the progression in Destiny 2 is considerably better than it was in Destiny 1. In Destiny 1, by the time I finished my MTO of the various expansions, I had maybe 2 legendary items, and my character was level 40, which is the max you could get to. I was supposed to be getting exotics by that point, but I still wasn't even getting legendaries, only rares. Meanwhile, I go over to Destiny 2, and both of my level 20 characters are now completely decked out in legendaries and exotics. I didn't go out and do an excessive amount of grinding, I just played the game normally, and it was giving me plenty of loot that was actually rather nice. And it's that kind of improvement that actually makes the game feel more rewarding than the original Destiny. And that brings up something that's very important to mention. A lot of the problems this game has are due to it being a sequel to the original Destiny and not going quite far enough to improve things. There are a rather low number of locations for you to visit, and they don't feel really different enough from locations you saw in the original Destiny. All of the enemies are going to be pretty much the exact same ones you were fighting in the original Destiny, but with a few slight differences here and there. That means that if you played the original Destiny and you got tired of fighting the Fallen, the Cabal, the Hive, and the Taken, well, you're not going to be very happy about this one because you're fighting all of the same in this one. And to make matters worse, it's the same exact enemy types that you'd already fought too. It gets very repetitive very quickly, especially when you consider that the enemy AI is pretty much brain dead. They barely even take cover, they have really no tactics to them, and they ultimately pose no real challenge to you whatsoever other than the simple amount of damage output that they can do if they all attack you en masse. But before I get to the most damning similarity to the original Destiny of all, I want to mention something that they just bafflingly screwed up, which is actually moving around the various locations. You're not given a sparrow until after you've beaten the story, so you actually have to go through almost the entirety of the game on foot. On certain places, this means it just drags on and on and on, at least until you get a sparrow, which is at the very end of the game. Of course, the funny thing is, you could actually get lucky and find a sparrow and a loot drop before you actually hit that point. That's actually what happened to me. I actually found a loot drop sparrow before I was able to get the one that was associated with the campaign, and that made things move along much quicker. And the weird thing about it is that none of the sparrows are actually bound to your level or anything, so you can just take one of your sparrows if you have an extra, put it in your vault, and if you start a new character, then you can just load up the character, go into the vault, and then get that sparrow right from the get-go. Again, it's kind of a baffling decision as to why they don't give you a sparrow at the beginning of the game. It just doesn't really make any sense given that a lot of these levels take quite a while to run across. I guess they want you to be super relieved if you manage to find a sparrow loot drop, or they want you to take in all the scenery on your first playthrough, but on your subsequent playthroughs on other characters, definitely make sure you hand off one of your extra sparrows to them, because you'll probably get a fair few sparrows as you play through the game, and that'll just help things move along much more quickly. But then we ultimately come to the one really nasty problem this game has, and the one thing that is making it hemorrhage players, which is that there's basically nothing to do in the endgame. You're given a few challenges that you can complete, but those are ridiculously easy to do, so they're not really much of a challenge. You gain access to the Iron Banner, which is a seasonal event, and so if you're out of season, then you won't be able to do anything with it. You gain access to the Faction Rally, which is a timed event, and if you don't manage to sign up with one of the factions in time, then you have to wait until the next period that it's active. And all that really means is that as you're playing the game, you're going to be getting tokens that you can spend at a special vendor for a specific faction in order to get faction-specific gear. There are also a few strikes that you can go on, which are basically the extended dungeons that have to be played in co-op with up to 3 total players, and those are okay. I mean, they're pretty much the exact same as they were in the original Destiny. You just go into a dungeon and eventually you have a boss fight at the end of it. They're nothing particularly involved, and it's certainly nothing that you aren't used to from having played through the game normally anyway. And of course there's the big thing you gain access to at the very end of the game after you've completed the campaign, which is the Leviathan raid. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I didn't go on the Leviathan raid, and that is simply because I don't have 6+ hours to spend going on a raid. I'm actually pretty busy most of the time. It means that I don't really have a lot of uninterrupted time to be able to play video games. That means if there's something as involved as the Leviathan raid where it can take upwards of 6+ hours to complete it if you don't know what you're doing, and even for the people who do know what they're doing, it takes closer to 3 hours to complete it, well, that's just more time than I have available to actually play a video game for a single sitting. Not to mention that the raid rewards really aren't all that great, and you do have to grind up to get to the power level that's minimum in order to actually go on the raid to begin with, and that power level is 260. By the time you finish the campaign, you're probably going to be closer to power level 220 or 230, and it takes actually quite a while in order to grind up to get to the point where you can go on the raid. But here's the thing. I've described everything there is to the endgame of Destiny 2 already. There's PvP, there's the Leviathan raid, and there's strikes. And that's pretty much it. You can go and you can grind public events, you can go and you can go on certain adventures that unlock as well as certain quests that unlock at the end of the game. But the adventures and quests are a one and done kind of deal, so once you finish them, then there's not really anything else to do. And when you put that on top of a game that's already incredibly repetitive to begin with, it means that the end game is going to wear thin extremely quickly. This is something that plagued the original Destiny, and it seems like they haven't figured out how to get rid of that problem in Destiny 2 as well. They try to mitigate it a bit by putting in places that you can explore called Lost Sectors, which are basically just mini dungeons that have a single loot chest at the end of it after you beat a mini-boss. And they try to introduce weekly events as well as daily events that you can come back to and actually complete those in order to have something at least slightly different. But even then, a lot of the time, you're actually repeating content. For example, if you go on Ikora's Meditations, then those are literally just replaying campaign missions at a higher difficulty. It makes the endgame just feel incredibly sparse, and that's actually a real shame, because up to that point, it's actually pretty enjoyable. The shooting mechanics are pretty solid. They actually have a pretty reasonable way of redoing the weapon system to where you now have kinetic, energy, and power weapons. And you really can find certain weapon types that you really like using that are good in certain situations and not in others, and you have to vary up your tactics a bit depending on what your loadout is. And of course, some of the weapons have a fair bit of oomph behind them to where they have some fairly noticeable recoil that you have to control, and of course they do quite a bit of damage when they hit things. You gotta make liberal use of your powers in order to deal with large groups of enemies that may or may not be absolutely stomping on you. And on top of all of that, you want to be aiming for the weak spots on enemies, which are admittedly painfully obvious, but at least they actually have weak spots that you can target, and there's a bit of varied tactics depending on what you're fighting. But all things considered, it actually makes the combat system feel pretty punchy. It's a looter shooter that doesn't necessarily feel like it's all about getting better loot. That's something that's actually very well appreciated and really helps it out in the long run, but when you get to the end game, everything just grinds to a screeching halt. And ultimately, the lack of a satisfying endgame, the peer-to-peer networking, and the numerous issues that pop up throughout the course of the game with regards to the plot holes as well as other gameplay issues that make it ultimately very repetitive, mean that Destiny 2 is a fairly difficult game to recommend in its current state unless you get it on sale for really cheap. As a whole, it's definitely an improvement on the original Destiny, but the original Destiny really wasn't very good at all. And in the grand scheme of things, Destiny 2 ends up being an at times rather enjoyable looter shooter that is best played in co-op with your friends, but is ultimately too similar to its predecessor in numerous ways that make it very difficult to outright recommend. And ultimately, that brings this thing to a 2.5 out of 5. It's a somewhat underwhelming game that has plenty of room for improvement, and I do legitimately hope that Bungie improves the game, because this is the kind of game where you can look at it and you can see the promise that's lying underneath the surface. You can see that there is a good game buried somewhere in there, but in its current state, it's just got too much muck caked on it that needs to be scraped off before they can get to that good game. Thanks for watching.